Really, until the 11th hour before I wrote this column, I was convinced that the school had overreacted and the students were the victims that they were being portrayed to be, and I was all set to defend their right to free speech. But then I read an item that was similar to the item that you just talked about, which is the Associated Press actually was one of the first groups to report that the students had been warned beforehand not to wear or wave any flag on clothing or bandanas or whatever. So then it really struck me that what this was really about was defiance. This was about a bunch of bratty kids defying the school authorities, not just them, but others who also wore flags, apparently. And this was no coincidence. These 5 kids, John, didn't just always get the spirit. All of a sudden, they spontaneously got the spirit to be patriotic all at once. That would be a heck of a coincidence. This was a conspiracy to go and stick their thumb in the eye of both the administration and the students. They wanted a reaction. They did to be provocative, and they got a reaction, so it all worked out.
Let's bring Chris in here. Chris, are these students patriots or brats?
Well, you know, you can call it defiance if you want, but there were some American patriots back in 1775, 1776 who were rather defiant toward British authorities. And you have to remember something about the First Amendment rights here. Think of the most on-point Supreme Court case that we have, and that's the case of Tinker versus Des Moines. Back in 1969, some high school students wore black armbands to symbolize their defiant position that they thought the U.S. should not be involved in the Vietnam War. Well, lots of political speech is defiant. The fact that it's defiant doesn't mean that you don't have First Amendment protections.
Well, are you drawing a moral equivalence between these kids wearing an American flag on Cinco de Mayo and what happened in 1776?
Well, I think the better equivalent is what happened in 1968, 69, when the kids in that high school in Des Moines said, we have a political position and we are expressing it symbolically by what we wear.
John, Chris is only telling part of the story, though. The other part of the Tinker decision is that was, again, in 1969. Since then, all through the 1980s, you had in the Bethel case, in the Hazelwood case, you had the Supreme Court chipping away at that and basically giving more authority to the school system and to the school administrators. And I find it curious that conservatives, having cheered on that trend all those years, now have done a 180, to use your phrase, and now all of a sudden the school administrator is a Latino, the kids who are being oppressed are these white kids, and they flipped over and now they've changed their entire position. I'm consistent, they're not. I mean, the idea that conservatives are suddenly now cheering on the ACLU is ludicrous. The fact is they have to own up to the fact that the Supreme Court has pretty consistently in the last 20 years chipped away at some of those Tinker protections.
Chris, how far does the First Amendment go at a high school?
Well, the Tinker case, the Supreme Court precedent that we were talking about in the last segment, does say that students don't shed their First Amendment rights when they enter the schoolhouse gate. Now, there are obviously some exceptions. They can't have obscene clothing. They can't be disruptive. They can't be chanting during class to disrupt the educational process. But the notion that wearing an American flag disrupts the educational process is a bit of a stretch.
Well, does disruption have to be overt, Ruben Navarrete, or can it be subtle?
It can be subtle, but I don't think there was anything subtle about this. This was Cinco de Mayo. I have trouble with the concept of the American flag being offensive or disruptive. But to think about the fact that these kids deliberately wore the American flag and, according to your reports, were taunting the other students, this was not something that they just picked that date out of a hat. They did it deliberately because they saw this as a contrast. You wave the Mexican flag, here I'll wave the American flag.
Right.
So,
But what it really comes down to is exactly what you said. The concept of the American flag is being seen as offensive or disruptive. Right. Is there any instance in this country in which that is our national flag, and that's the symbol of everything it means to be a citizen of this country? Is there any instance in which that can be offensive or disruptive?
I have a tough time thinking of one. I think if you want to be technical about it, they shouldn't be wearing flags on T-shirts or on bandanas to begin with. I mean, the U.S. Code is pretty clear on that you're not supposed to be using the flag in these commercial enterprises that kind of way. You sell T-shirts that way. But, you know, I have a tough time, again, as an American-born U.S. citizen, tough time imagining this. But I know a finger in the eye when I see one. And these were a bunch of bratty kids, by the way, backed up by bratty parents who are condoning this kind of action when they shouldn't be.
I know Chris is going to jump in right here, but first of all, you mentioned the United States Code when it comes to the flag. It's Code Title 4, Chapter 1, subsection 8D. It says, quote, the flag should never be used as wearing apparel.
Well, that statute is normally interpreted as not actually wearing a rectangular flag itself as clothing, a la Mick Jagger. Having stars and stripes on your tie is not normally assumed to be in violation of that statute. But I think, let's step back here. The notion that school administrators would be saying it is offensive and inappropriate to wear anything that has the stars and stripes on it just shows how crazy things have gotten in some schools. And going back to the Tinker case, you know, 45 years ago, some school administrators were saying, no, you can't wear that armband because that shows disrespect for our country's involvement in the war. Now we're at a point where some schools are saying you can't even wear the American flag because that disrespects somebody. I think things have gone too far in some schools.